right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Inside Writing. This show is presented by Gotham Writers Workshop, offering writing classes of all types and sizes. You can visit us at gothamwriters.com. A couple quick announcements. A reminder that if you've missed any episode of Inside Writing, you can find the recorded versions on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. The same for the show today. It will be available later today, and on all those platforms, I'll also be emailing it to everyone that registered today. Moving into the show for today, a reminder that at any point in this show, you can submit your own questions for our panelists using the Q&A section of the Zoom window. The sooner you get those in, the better. Around 15 minutes to the end of the show, I will start picking some questions from there and posing them to the panelists. So the sooner you get those in, the better. Also, I've changed the Q&A the settings so you can see other people's questions as well. So if you see someone has already asked a question, you don't need to ask it again. So today we're talking about writing and publishing short genre fiction. Just a quick side note on that as well. Since genre fiction covers such a broad range of topics, we're doing 2 genre fiction episodes. So today we'll skew a little more towards science fiction, and part 2, which is in 2 weeks, we'll skew more towards fantasy. But again, we're going to cover as many genres as we can with both of them. So enough announcements. Let's get into the discussion for today. I'm going to start with a quote from Ray Bradbury, who said, "Science fiction is the most important literature in the history of the world because it's the history of ideas, the history of our civilization birthing itself. Science fiction is central to everything we've ever done." More on that later. Now we are going to meet our panelists. So our first panelist today, award-winning author of the science fiction novel Central Station, as well as several other novels and pieces appearing in Apex, Asimov's Analog, and more, Lavie Tidhar. Hello, Lavie.
Hello.
Hey there, you got it.
I managed to unmute.
There we go.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Our second panelist, managing editor of Apex, as well as the author of the novel The Weight of Chains and pieces appearing in Mountain Dead, Dark Tales of Terror, and more, Lesley Conner. Hello, Lesley.
Hi.
Hi there, Lesley. All right, so we normally start our shows with a definition, but since genre fiction is such a broad topic, I won't ask you to define that. Instead, Lavie, I wonder if we could start with you and ask what you see as the primary difference between science fiction and fantasy.
It's controversial, but I don't. It's the sort of answer designed to annoy the purists. You know, and if you talk to a hardcore science fiction person, they'll always take mortal offense at the idea. But there isn't actually any difference between them. At least from a practical perspective, from a writing perspective, you're pretty much applying the same set of tools. There's one important distinction to make, and that is that science fiction is easier to sell because less people are writing it. So technically, I think Lesley might be able to back me up or correct me on this, but my understanding is that the magazines would usually receive about 2/3 of fantasy stories and only about 1/3 of science fiction stories. So I always think, you know, if you want to sell some stories, get into those robots and starships, you stand slightly more of a chance, maybe.
Lesley, do you have any point to add to that before I get into asking you a question?
Well, I'm not sure because I don't see what the base of our slush is. Like, we have a slush team that handles that. So by the time it gets up to me, I'm not sure if I'm seeing the same perspective that Lavie is. But I can say that I kind of agree that there's not this huge distinctions between science fiction and fantasy, because I mean, at least at Apex magazine, we're looking for stories that kind of blur that edge anyways. Like, it's harder to sell a straight science fiction story or especially a straight horror story or a straight fantasy. We want something that's kind of like bends that a little bit. Mm-hmm. So for me, like, it's fun to kind of play with those rules and stuff and make them both or neither at all, kind of.
Mm-hmm. And you both touched on points I want to get into a little bit more later, but the last definition I want to get out of the way is this term speculative fiction, which we hear quite often applied to genre fiction as well. Lesley, let's start with you. What does speculative fiction mean?
Well, speculative fiction is going to have a supernatural or sci-fi element. Like, really, most sci-fi and fantasy is pretty solidly speculative fiction. When you get into horror, there's a lot of horror that is not also speculative fiction because it's very solidly set in the real world. There's no playing around with it. But you kind of have to play with the reality to have speculative fiction. It's something that's not quite set completely in our reality.
Mm-hmm. Lavie, anything to add to that about speculative?
No, I think my understanding of the term is that people started to use it because they wanted to make the genre sound a little more respectable, whereas sci-fi wasn't. So people started using speculative fiction. Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that there's something outside of reality, but I think one of the things that I find really interesting is that there's no such thing as realist fiction, really. All fiction is sort of a construct about made-up characters doing made-up things. But genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy does have its own sort of a century and more of a century of history that it builds on. It has its own tropes, its own sort of formulas, its own gadgets, its own repeating motifs. And I think that's partly one big thing that distinguishes it, that it does have its own tradition. And if you sort of come into it blind, you end up a lot of the time just repeating something someone may have done in 1932, and you end up doing it badly because you're not familiar with it. But yeah, as an umbrella term, I think it's pretty meaningless. Again, it's just to make us look slightly less dorky, I think.
I like it. All right, so enough of definitions. I want to get into talking about the writing of genre pieces in particular. So, Lavie, I want to start with you. I want to start the discussion with world building and how you go about creating a world to base a story in, especially when you're confined to shorter pieces. Like in a novel, you have room to build it out. But when you're building a new fictional world in short fiction, how do you go about establishing this new world?
Well, again, I feel like all my answers are very unhelpful, but I don't really believe in world building as a concept. And I say that, and I have friends who write these epic fantasy novels, and before they wrote the book, they wrote a book about the book. They wrote a whole Bible with every plant species on the southern continent detailed and so on. It doesn't really matter. You're not going to see it in the book. The important thing is really to find that one detail that sells the world, and that's kind of the trick. That's the hard bit, is what makes this world different but believable. And it's finding that one thing that you can mention, you can mention it in the first paragraph or on the first page, or it's just the one detail that tells you not only this world is different in some way, but it shows you that the author knows it, that it's been thought through to some extent. And to me, that's what world building is. It's made out of little bits that are put in. It's not necessarily having to build an entire world just to tell a story in it. Mm-hmm. How you do that, that's probably the harder bit. I'm not entirely sure. But, other people will definitely sit down and just work it all out. I know science fiction writers who use Excel spreadsheets to work out the gravitational pull on a planet. Don't ask me how you do that, or to work out the plans, and it's fun. But I think what happens to people a lot is they get so sucked into the fun of just creating this fictional world that they never write the story in it.
But when it's done really well, especially in short fiction, it comes through. Like, there are times that I read a story in the slush pile where I don't know what's outside of that story. Like, because I'm only reading what's right there on the page, but it draws you in, and you're like, I know that the author knows that there's more to this world, and I want to see it. Like, if the story is done super well, that little tidbit, those little tiny things that they give you in the story are so intriguing that as an editor, and a reader, more importantly, I'm excited to read more. I mean, there have been stories that I'm just like, I really wish this was a novel. Like, I really wish I had more than this 5,000 words.
Mm-hmm. I think my favorite writer for kind of doing this stuff was a guy called Cordwainer Smith, who wrote in the 60s and 70s. And he clearly had this entire universe in his head, but all we're getting are these little short stories. And in the short story, there's always references to stuff that happened maybe centuries ago, is a myth in this world. And if you follow it, it makes you want to know what happened. And when you follow the breadcrumbs, some of those actually have their own stories. So you do get to find out the story of Lost Khmer or whatever happened then. But some of them never got written. So you have a sense of this enormous universe that we only see little bits of. Now, I agree with you that when it works well, people always say they want more, they wish it was a novel. But my feeling is always like, that's what you need to get out of the story. The last thing you need is the actual novel that bangs on and hammers it in. And the best example in cinema, I think, was John Wick. You know, I watched the first John Wick, and it had all those little details. You know, it was basically world building 101. It had the gold coins and the Assassin's Hotel, and it left you wanting to find out more. Then they ended up making 2 more movies, and sadly, they actually told you, and no one cares. It's not interesting at all. They make the gold in Morocco or something. Who cares? It was much more fun because it was mysterious, and we don't need to know everything. We just want to have the sense that there's a lot more left unsaid behind the page.
Mm-hmm. So, Lavie, to follow up on that, I'm curious, when you write a story, do you have more of this world in your head? Like, do you know more about this world than you're putting on the page, or do you just kind of throw in tidbits to tie it together?
Well, I don't want to give away. I'm just making it up as I go along. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the times I could just start with a story with just having an image. I mean, this thing I wrote, I'm working on right now, I just had an image of a robot and a flower, and I thought, I don't know anything more about them, but I know there's a robot and there's a flower, and I kind of want to know what happens with it. And I actually wrote just a tiny little thing, and I sent it to Apex, and I had to kind of pull it back because I realized I wanted to know more about this robot and what it was doing, and I'm still writing it now. Basically, still have no idea what this robot is doing, but it's kind of a fun character. Most of the science fiction specifically I've been writing is in a massive shared universe. And so I would write tiny little details into a story, and then maybe a year down the line, I'll follow it up and I'll actually write the story around it. Mm-hmm. So I know there's a few people who are kind of trying to track all the different stories and see how they all fit together. But yeah, I kind of develop it as I go along. Mm-hmm. I don't sit and... Yeah, occasionally I'll sit down with a notebook and make a few notes if I'm stuck, just to make sure I know what I'm doing. But I don't have any Bible documents. I don't have that sort of TV style writing.
And Lesley, is world building, is that a selling point for you, or does it still always come down to the story and how well the characters work in that world?
Oh, it's always going to come down to the story. Because you can have a really great world, and you might be able to sell it to our slush readers. And I might even be like, there's something really compelling about this, and I'm going to bump it up to Jason because I don't want to be the one that says no. But Jason will kick it out. Because if it's just world building, like, we need something beyond that. Like, that's great, and it can pull the reader along, but there needs to be a plot to hang on that world.
Mm-hmm. And then, one part of world building, especially in genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy, is there have to be rules and whatnot that govern that world. Lesley, how do writers go about establishing these boundaries of what the world can and cannot do? Is it just kind of at the writer's discretion?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think it's definitely at the writer's discretion. And I think that especially in short fiction, it's maybe easier to get away if you're not quite solid on your rules yet, because it's such a narrow view of an entire universe. So if you're doing, a series of stories that are set in the same universe, your rules could evolve over time. I think that E. Catherine Tobler's circus stories kind of show that, because she's been writing those stories for a decade. And we did Apex published a collection of them called The Grand Tour. And as you're reading them, you can see somewhat that the rules kind of have evolved and solidified and changed a little bit. And as individual stories, that's okay, because you don't see it in each individual story. And it's neat then going back and reading a collection of them, and as a reader getting to see how things maybe changed a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, Lavie, with the rules and the you've spoken about the different tidbits of world building that you put in. How do you decide what those tidbits are? How do you decide what goes in, what stays, what's important, and what's not?
I don't think it's very conscious, but just to go back to this idea of rules, I mean, I think rules are fun because they give you, I think a lot of genre, because it comes from this idea of formula stories. It's very rigid, it's very structured. And it's a bit like writing a complex poem, that you get the work of art, not despite of, but because of the rules, the framework, But at the same time, I had to teach this a few times to undergraduates, which is what made me think a lot about it. If you look at British fantasy fiction, the history of British fantasy fiction, there's two big voices, right? There's C.S. Lewis and Narnia, and there's J.R.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings. Now, what happens in Lord of the Rings is that if he's going to mention, if Tolkien is going to mention some plant on page 2,500 of Lord of the Rings, that he's worked the entire history of this plant and the evolution of where this plant comes from and what healing properties it's got for elves and whether you can use it as a poison. Look at Narnia, on the other hand. Okay, C.S. Lewis, the way it starts, there's a street lamp in the snow and there's a fawn with an umbrella carrying Christmas presents. Where does the umbrella come from? Is there an umbrella factory in Narnia that makes it? Do we start working out the implications of Turkish delight in Narnia and who manufactures Turkish delight and how they smuggle it into Narnia, which would be a fun story to do. But what I'm saying is C.S. Lewis couldn't care less about world building. It's magic. It's magic. And I think the tragedy, in a way, tragedy is a strong word, but the problem we have with a lot of genre is the law, the rule people want. Everyone wants to do Tolkien, no one's really doing Narnia. So everyone wants to develop the 3,000-year history of the dragon egg that, hatched the whatever. And there's actually a whole tradition in British fantasy fiction that just says, look, magic happens, weird stuff happens. And it's the logic of dreams. It's not the logic of a rigidly, an analog science fiction story. And I think there's actually room for both of those approaches. It's just that we've become so conditioned to the idea of rules in fantasy. And I think the people who do them extremely well. I mean, if you look at the way Tim Powers constructs magical systems and the rules that govern them and works out the implications, I think is amazing. But at the same time, there's a place for, the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, or Norrell, I can never remember how she pronounces it, where the magic just happens because it's magic and it's dream logic. So, yeah.
Lesley, anything to add to that? Do you see more of one than the other in submissions?
I think we don't see as many stories where it's this huge universe that goes on for thousands of years. I don't think that we see tons and tons of that at Apex. I mean, sure, some, but more, I think that it's more self-contained to the story. And that's why when you get one, when you can, as a reader and an editor, you feel like there is more beyond that. It is a little bit exciting, but it's definitely not necessary. The stories that are well constructed and self-contained are just as valid and just as good.
Mm-hmm. So I want to move on from world building now and touch briefly on theme and how you approach theme in your writing and what you look for in a theme. So Lesley, I want to start with you on this. Is theme important in a story? Do you need to see a deeper meaning to a story, or can it just be a good story about good characters and relationships?
It definitely can just be a good story about good characters and relationships, but there is something about the theme or it having a deeper meaning that sometimes will, if it's done well, make a story stand out. I know that there have definitely been times when I've read a story and the story that you're reading, if you can take it completely at face value and it's a completely wonderful story. But then if you look at it and look at what's going on in society and the world around us now, you can definitely see the mirrors. We have a wonderful story, and I can't remember Farga's last name, coming out in the January issue called Root Rot, and it on its own, taken just at face value, it is an amazing, amazing story. But then it also is our author editor interview for the month, and it goes so much beyond that into what's happening in the world we live in. And that definitely adds something, especially when you get a chance to talk to the author and kind of delve into that more. But to have a story that is just a really great story with really great characters, especially if you can make the editor and readers care, like if you can attach an emotion to that, then there doesn't have to be a deeper theme, in my opinion.
Lavie, what about you? When you're writing, are you actively trying to make a point, or are you just telling a story?
I've been known to make a point. No, I think everyone, okay, let me phrase it this way. There's a lot of short stories that go out every month to magazines, right? And 99% of them get rejected. And most of them, my understanding is, are not bad. They tell the story, they tell it fairly well. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a character that something happens to it. The reason all those stories don't make it through is that it just lacks that extra something, the thing that pushes it beyond that. I think, people come at writing. A story has to be more than the story, basically. It doesn't mean that you're writing a pointed political story, even though, I have written a few of them. My novels particularly are very sort of in-your-face, politically motivated works. But it needs to have that extra something. It needs to have more. It needs to have something to say. If you don't have something to say, either you're not going to have a story that can really sell, or you're simply not going to write it. And I have friends who are good writers who are simply not compelled to write because they have nothing burning that they want to get out. So I think you need that dysfunction. You need to have that, whether you're motivated by anger or that's my main motivation. But you need to bring that into the story. You don't consciously sit down and think my theme for today is going to be despair. I'm going to write a story about despair. But it can't help but feed into what you're writing, into the characters, into the world, into the prose.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most successful stories that come through our slush that I see are ones that don't necessarily, there's not necessarily something that obviously the author is talking about, but that evoke an emotion in the reader. Whether that, now typically when it's an Apex story, it's a darker emotion because we do dark science fiction and fantasy. But if you can evoke an emotion and make the reader care or feel something, you have a much more, for at least in my experience of getting past, say, the first readers and then the second readers, because, then you're pulling for that story. You've created a connection that helps them champion that story on up through the slush pile. We have a Discord for Apex Magazine with all of our slush readers. And it's amazing how invested those first readers get in the stories that they push up the queue. Like, they're waiting for me to read them, because I let them know anytime I bump a story up to Jason. And they're looking to see, like, this story that made them feel something that they connected to. They're hoping and waiting right there with the writers who don't see on the inside. But I mean, they get very upset if a story that they connected to in some way maybe doesn't connect for me. So I think if you can create an emotion in your audience, that makes for more successful stories.
And Lesley, I want to sneak another genre in here, a horror genre. You write primarily in horror. Do you approach theme differently in horror, or is it all pretty much falling within the same umbrella?
It depends on, I mean, a lot of horror you can approach with a very specific theme. And my novel really came from, I was obsessed with serial killers when I was a child. and so I knew about Gilles de Rais in 15th century France, and he kept bodies in his castle. And to give away the twist ending in my novel, I wanted to know what would happen if those bodies came back to life. And so that's, I wrote an entire novel because I wanted to see what would happen. I don't write as often now because we're all busy. But yeah, for me, it's taking something in history and twisting it, because that's what is interesting to me. Other horror writers obviously approach it very differently.
Lavie, with you write across multiple genres. Are you actively thinking where a story will fit? Is that worth your time, or is it just something where you write the story and then worry about that afterwards?
No, I mean, I do both to an extent. I mean, I'm one of those annoying people who only writes what they want to write. So, I don't really care about selling it. That's kind of a nice-ish byproduct, but it's not what I do. I think one of the big problems we have is actually a lot of novels are just short stories that just got pumped because of this idea that you want to see more of what happens in it. I think a lot of novels would have done better as short fiction. And so sometimes you get an idea, you have to see if that idea, what length is this idea, how much does it have behind it? And sometimes it's even, is this idea a short story or a book, or is it something else? Is it a comic? Is it a film? What is it, Sometimes you struggle to find, you're not sure where it is. I mean, I find with novels, for example, it takes me about 10 years of kind of thinking about them in the background before I actually sit down and write them. And sometimes, I just feel like I'll sit down and all I have is a very vague image in my head, and I'll just write the short story in one go. And I was like, oh, okay. I don't know where that came from, but there it is.
So I want to segue now, before we talk publishing, into another element of story building, which is character building. Lavie, let's start with you. When you're building characters, where do you draw from? Do you just kind of start and then throw random things at them? Are you pulling from people you know? How do you go about building a character to fit your story?
I'm not sure. I mean, that's one of the great mysteries. I found, again, I'm going back to novels rather than the short stories, but I found at the beginning I was writing these characters that were sort of a bit drifty, because I'm generally a bit drifty, and they were sort of nice, but they didn't, they weren't very active, and then people complain that your character isn't very active and doesn't actively go out and save the world. And I think, well, if it was me, I wouldn't really be actively saving the world. I'd sort of be drifting around. And at some point, I realized that I really enjoy writing horrible people. And I found that I put a lot of myself into that. I have one of my favorite books. Basically has Adolf Hitler as a private detective. Wardbury never rose to power, so he never became our Hitler. And I always thought that's my most personal character. And he's so frustrated, he's so full of hate and frustrated with the world, and it was very therapeutic to get that out. And obviously, an Adolf Hitler without power is very funny, whereas an Adolf Hitler with power is horrendous. But I think the main thing is to think of each character as a person, and it doesn't matter to that degree what character it is, but it's to understand that it's a full person, not defined by one specific thing, but still, fitting within, the world they come from. And actually, the first thing I do with characters that I don't know if enough people pay attention to, is the first thing I do is look at what their name is. Because your name actually says so much about you. And I say that as someone who has a name that not many people in the world have, and always confuses people. And yet, it has a very specific meaning. It has a very specific history. So if you're going to call a character Lavie, it can't be too many things. There's not many of us around. You pretty much have to be of a specific culture, of a specific language. So I think the names just tell you so much about a character. And to the extent that now, if a story starts with a character called, with like some generic-y sort of name, or Anglo-Saxon sort of name, I turn off quite a bit, because I just think I don't know, I'm not that interested in this person. So for me, that's what I spend most of my time on. And as soon as I have the name, it gives me the part of their history, part of their world, where they come from, who their relatives are, what interests them.
Mm-hmm. And Lesley, when you look at submissions, what are you looking for in a character?
I mean, to go off of what Lavie said, we're looking for someone who feels like a real person, like a person, because it's very, very evident if they're just a surface character and there's nothing beyond just very generalized, vague descriptions. So you're looking for characters who react like people and who maybe speak like real people. Like you're looking for someone who's good and just a little bit more than just blank generalization and vagueness.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I want to talk a bit about publishing now and what it takes to publish short fiction in the genre sphere. So Lavie, I want to start with you. How do you know when a piece is ready to be submitted?
Well, I mean, ready to be submitted doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to publish it. It's ready to be rejected is the way I look at a lot of them. I'm lucky that firstly I produce, clean copy pretty much. I mean, I don't spend, or rather, if I do rewrite, I rewrite as I go. So by the time I finish the story, I feel that it's almost there, At that point, I only go over it to kind of tidy up, find any typos, any errors. Usually I found I'll write the story, I leave it aside for a week or two, I'll come back to it, read through it, see if it still makes sense, start sending it out, hope that I don't start getting a pile of rejections. I have a giant folder on my computer full of stories that no one wanted to buy, and to be honest, are not very good. Occasionally I will write a story that is just not very good, and I would kind of make the decision to just leave it.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jeff Ford, who's an excellent short story writer, he said all you can hope for is that your average gets better, for rubbish stories versus good stories. But I don't know that you can sit on a story endlessly and tinker with it, and you're not going to make it great. You write the story and it's either going to be good or it's going to be okay. And if you're very, very lucky, every now and then you'll write a story that's really, really good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Lesley, do you often come across stories that you feel like could have been something you'd want to publish if they just spent more time or done a little bit different? And how much are you willing to work with writers?
The worst part as an editor is when you read a story and you're really invested in it, and you're ready to send it up to I'm ready to send it up to the editor-in-chief, and they don't stick the landing. It's like, I think that so often writers hear, you got to get a hook right in the beginning. Your beginning has to be strong. They hear that is kind of drilled into writers' heads, and it is important. If the beginning is boring, or if you wait too long in the story to actually tell me what the story is about, I'm going to pass, because if I'm bored, then our readers will be bored. But the ending is just as important. I mean, it's heartbreaking to get all the way to the end and then feel like it fell apart. Like the writer spent so much time focusing on that beginning that they didn't really figure out, like, they knew where they were trying to go, but something slipped in there. And, at that point, you just want to be like, please rewrite the ending of this, send it somewhere else, because the beginning is great, but you got to stick that landing. So, that's the part that, yes, have a strong hook, have a good beginning, but don't forget the end as well.
Mm-hmm. And that sounds like kind of a red flag. Are there any other red flags that writers can avoid? Any pitfalls, but if you come across, you're like, well, this is automatically, it's not working. Is there anything else that writers can try to avoid?
I mean, especially when you are talking about genre fiction, as an editor and a reader, I should know, because, we accept multiple genres. Like, we're not specifically a sci-fi magazine or specifically a fantasy magazine, but you also don't want to leave the reader hanging on what kind of world is this. If it's a 15-page story, I should not be a third of the way through and still have no idea what kind of world I'm in. Like, am I looking for science fiction more or fantasy? And it's completely okay to blur that, but it's not okay to have no idea. Like, if I'm a third of the way in, I'm not looking for a surprise twist ending 2/3 of the way through the story that's going to suddenly make me understand, this is how it's speculative fiction. I kind of need to know that earlier on, because, again, I'm going to be reading and I'm going to be going, okay, well, this story isn't for us because we are a speculative fiction market. And so it needs to be speculative fiction, at all. And so, yeah, that is something at the beginning I'm definitely looking for, is please tell me, what kind of world am I in? So how does this fit to Apex?
Mm-hmm. And Lavie, at what point in writing are you thinking about where to send a piece? Is that something you're thinking about from the beginning?
Quite often it is. It's because, I love writing short stories, and I've been doing this for a while. I've been submitting, and I enjoy the process of submitting. I enjoy the rejections, as weird as that sounds. Because you write a novel, and then it takes forever, and it takes forever to come out, and then if you're lucky, you'll get a nice review somewhere. But it's glacial, And with short stories, you have that immediacy of, you can send it out, and at least someone knows that someone bothered to read it, even if they just said no thank you. It's very exciting. So I do think about it quite a lot, like, maybe this. And I mean, I have to say, with Apex, one of the things I always love is Apex might take the weirder stuff, because I always struggle with the weirder stuff. I still have some unsold stories that are just weird, and no one ever really buys my weird stuff. And I know if I write a science fiction story, I can sell it. It's not going to be an issue. But if I go a little bit weird, it's much harder to place. Mm-hmm. So I do think about it quite a lot. I don't let it influence me, but it's just something that's in the back of my mind. Who might be better for it? But what, you never know. I mean, it's not down to you; it's down to the editors, and you shouldn't really make the decisions for them. You should just spam them with your stories until you wear them down eventually.
Whereas as an editor, I'm going to tell you, you should know what a magazine publishes. Don't spam us with stuff that you absolutely know we aren't going to publish.
So, Lesley, do you think that people should be thinking about, like,
I think that you should definitely know the markets. If you've never read an issue of Apex Magazine, then it's available for free to read online. Read an issue or two, at least to get an idea of what sort of stories, and read recent issues. Like, don't, if it's a magazine that's been around for 10 years, don't start at issue 1. Start backwards. Because then you get more of an idea of what the editors are actually looking for. Because there are times when I'm reading a story and I'm like, this is a wonderful story. It's wonderfully written. But why did they send it here? Because it's not, we're looking for darker stuff. If you have a very light, happy story, you don't want to send it to Apex, because it doesn't matter how good it is. You're going to get please send this somewhere else because it's really great. I know that, sometimes authors will feel like, you hear that it sounds generic, like this isn't an Apex story or this isn't a good fit for us. And I feel a lot of times that authors feel like that's just a brush off, but in many times it's not, because we do get a lot of really great submissions. We get really quality stories. But if it isn't a story that fits with the type of things that we publish, it doesn't matter how great it is. We're not going to accept a story that doesn't fit what we're looking for. So, definitely at least know what the major, magazines that you're looking to publish, like, what are they looking for? Read a couple of issues.
So I have so many more questions, but I have to get into audience Q&A now. So I want to pick some of the audience questions here and pose them to you. First one, Lavie, I'll ask you first. If you write a story that ends up not having a deeper meaning, how do you go back and find that deeper meaning, or do you just set it aside?
I have no idea. I mean, I don't think meaning is something that gets hammered on. Meaning comes from story. And I can't, I've always been interested in the idea of literary criticism. When you look at the text, you don't look at the person who wrote it. You don't look at any of that. You look at the text itself and you ask, what is the text saying? And a text is always going to have an underlying ideology. It's going to reflect the attitudes and the biases and the concerns of its time, whether you intended to or not. It might just not be a very good story. That's what I think it comes down to. At which point, either no one's going to buy it, or you should just retire it yourself. But it's impossible to say that stories don't have anything behind them. Stories would always have an ideology behind them. They would have concerns behind them. As frothy and as light and as meaningless as you try and make them.
Mm-hmm. Lesley, anything to add to that? If somebody goes back and sees that there's not really a meaning there?
Oh, well, I mean, you also need to remember, I went to school to get an English degree, and one of the things we always had to do, you're talking about literary criticism, like one of the things that in school I had to do all the time was read text and then say what I felt like it meant. And the thing is that one of the things I learned in school is if I could go to the text and pull out reasons why I felt this is what it meant, it didn't matter if somebody else disagreed with me if I could back it up. So your readers may put an intention on what you wrote that you didn't think of. You know what I'm saying? Like, the author doesn't always have to give the meaning, because the reader will give it a meaning. And it goes back to that the text is a part of the society and the culture that you're in at that time. So I think that you don't always have to force a meaning in there, because if it's a good quality story, readers will find one for you.
Mm-hmm. Next question. Let me send this one to Lavie first as well. What advice do you have for writers in figuring out if an idea is best suited to a short story or a novel?
I think if in doubt, it's a short story, basically. I mean, the idea of, it's one thing that drives me insane is to get a whole novel based on one idea. You know, in fact, I don't even like short stories that are based on one idea. What I like to do is kind of take all the ideas, you know, this is kind of what I've done with the Central Station stories, is take all the ideas and then stick them in the background and kind of ignore them and just write about people, you know, getting married or something, you know, just, or going for a meal. And I stuck all the shiny, great sci-fi ideas in the background. And then they're like, yeah, they're great, they're ideas, fantastic, you know. But you need a little bit more than just an idea to write anything, you know. It really is about the characters and the world and what you're trying to say. And if you're writing a book, especially, you can't get away with, you know, I like writing mood stories. I like writing slice of life science fiction. Stories where not much happens. You know, they're set in a futuristic background maybe, but they're just about normal people doing more or less normal things, you know, which admittedly annoys a lot of people that nothing happens, because, again, Western science fiction is so driven by the action-adventure plot that people will look at your stuff and they will say it has no plot, when what they mean is it has no action-adventure plot. Now, you can't really get away with it if you're going to write a 90,000-word novel. You would have to be an exceptionally good writer to write a 90,000-word novel when nothing happens, you know, which is why having a mystery plot or an action-adventure plot or, you know, anything that makes stuff happen is very useful when you have 90,000 words to fill. So my feeling is always, unless you have a really good reason to write a novel, it shouldn't be a novel, you know. And I'm saying that as someone who's being reluctantly dragged into writing longer and longer books now. So you do need that conviction. You do need that drive. You need to have that feeling that the story you're telling is large enough. But again, I'm a purist. I prefer short fiction. You know, I certainly read more short fiction. My other thing, I don't know if anyone's asking this, but going back to something Lesley said earlier, I think what you do get with a lot of short stories is they start too early, I guess, and they end maybe too late. Like, you know, a lot of stories I see, I would just cut the first page and nothing bad would happen. It's like just get on with it. Just start. Don't start in the beginning, start in the middle. So I don't, you know, don't give me time to catch up, and you don't have to spend the first page explaining things to me. Just kind of start. So I don't know what's going on, and I'd like to figure it out as I go along. You know, just give me what I need when I need it. The other thing, again, not answering that question, but endings, but that's what it was, endings. They're hard, man. I mean, endings are hard, and I've learned, actually, that basically I go into some horrible sort of monster mood when I'm doing endings, and no one wants to go near me, and I just stomp around. I'm like, oh, I have to figure out this ending. They're not easy, you know. A good ending is really not that easy. I'm a fan of. I had this very eccentric literature professor once, and he taught me. I think they used to do it in poems. That you have a poem and something major happens, and it ends with sort of a yellow dog rooting in the bins, you know. And it's kind of, I really like that. I just think that's a nice, because you kind of reach that point and then you just go into some meaningless detail in the background. The way science fiction really works with endings, there's only two types of endings for science fiction, or at least, again, that's an argument that has been made. That they either end in transcendence, i.e. 2001 and so on, or they end with the rejection of transcendence. You know, those are the only two endings you get in science fiction, as it were. So that's certainly something I've occasionally had in mind, that idea. Because science fiction is, in a way, it's all about seeking that, the numinous, the thing you can't really comprehend, you know, you can't explain. So that's my 2 cents of.
Thank you. Next question, Lesley, I'll pose this one to you. What's more important in science fiction short story, but I'll say in genre short stories in general, character or plot? Do you categorize, or do you put one above the other?
I mean, I don't know that I necessarily would consciously put one above the other, but oh, that's hard. Because my gut reaction is I want to be like character. Like, I want to love that character. Like, I want to be invested in that character, but you have to have a good plot to make me invested in that character. So, I mean, as much as I can love a character, if I'm not going to fall in love with them if there's not a good plot making me fall in love with them, if that makes sense. So I don't know that I would put one above the other. They're both important aspects. I mean, I think you can write a good character with a weaker plot. I'm not sure you can have a plot that maybe doesn't have an engaging character, but the plot's not going to sell as easily to me if I'm not, you know, if there's not a character that I'm rooting for. So I think that's why my gut reaction is to say character. But they're both really important. I don't think that I would focus on one over the other.
Mm-hmm. Lavie, what about you? Is there one that you think about more than another? Like, I know for a lot of people, stories start, you have an idea for a character and you fit that character into a plot. Well, what do you start with, one or the other? You're on mute, Lavie.
Yeah. I don't love plots a great deal. I think plot is essentially an artificial construct that you obviously have to deal with, because you're writing fiction, you're not writing a journalism. So I do think about plots a lot, simply because I dislike them and I would have much preferred to get rid of them. But when they work well, they provide a skeleton for what you do want to explore, you know. And the nice thing about genre, which again, genres are things I think about a lot, because a genre is essentially a set of conventions that evolved at different times. And some of those conventions are conceptual and some of those conventions are very plot-based. So if you look at crime and mystery stories, they are heavily built on a plot, you know. And the more, have I lost you? The more I go, the more interested I am in things like Golden Age mysteries that are so formal, you know, in their way, that you have the victim, the detective, the suspect, the murderer, and you know, that plot is the same plot. It's the same plot. It's literally a graph, and yet you can do so many different things with it. Mm-hmm. So I've become very interested in looking at plots and thinking, okay, you are ridiculous, artificial things that I absolutely don't approve of, but at the same time, you're fantastic. You're so flexible. There's so many things you can do with them. And so, you know, I like looking at simple plots because they allow me, because I'm a simple person, and they allow me to just forget about the plot and focus on what I want to do with it. So, you know, things like the quest plot, you have to go and find something, you know, fantastic. Because it just gives you things to happen throughout. The mystery plot or the detective plot, again, it just gives you an excuse for your character to move around and stick its nose into places it's not supposed to go and make things happen. But that's all plots are. They're like the skeleton that you hang your story on.
Mm-hmm. So last two questions. Lesley, I want to start with you for this one. Recommendations for people that want to read, let's stick with science fiction for this, but recommendations for people that want to write more science fiction. What can they be reading? Both, if you can think of novels or short stories or just writers in general that you think are a good starting point for people that want to get into it.
Immediately, I think Sarah Pensker is writing amazing short fiction. Merck Finn Wolfmore, I really like their science fiction. I'm trying to think of who, when I see their name pop up in our slush pile, am I like immediately I want to grab that story and read it. I really enjoy Marie Vibert's work. She writes very nice science fiction where I feel very, very connected to the characters. Man, I should have. You would think that I never read anything.
I always
read continuously.
I always just like to see who the first names are that you think of, and that's always that's very helpful. These names that you've given already.
I'll let Lavie answer, and I'm going to keep thinking because I know as soon as somebody else is talking, all these names are going to come to me. But yeah, Sarah Pensker to me and Merck and Marie are all amazing. They're all people that I'm excited every time I see their name come up in our slush pile. Amal Singh is also very, very good. He has a story that's on Apex, that's on Jason's desk right now that I'm kind of like peering at it. Like, is he going to read it? Is he going to accept it? Because I want him to. So yeah, those are the names that immediately come to mind.
Mm-hmm. Libby, what about you? What are some recommendations?
Well, I'm not going to give you any names. I mean, I think it's more about, as Lesley said, is looking at the magazines, and there's so much available for free online right now that if you just go and look at the top magazines, if you go and look at what Tor are publishing, what Clarksworth are publishing, what Apex are publishing, just the free stuff online without even buying, FSF or Analog or Asimov. It gives you a good idea of where science fiction is now, because there's no point talking about where science fiction was 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And also there's no point looking at novels, because novels are lagging behind the short story field. If you want to see the exciting stuff, the cutting edge stuff, the stuff that's happening now, it's always in short fiction. So I would say read the later stuff, or get a year's best anthology or whatever. My focus is really more on international science fiction. So I've done 5 anthologies for Apex of international science fiction writers. And many of the writers that I picked up very early on went on to become huge names in the field. They went on to get the awards and to get the book deals. And it was very easy to spot straight away that they were very good. So you could look at those. I'm doing a giant volume of the best of World SF in hardcover next year, which is very cool. So, who I think is great is in there, basically. The other thing I would say, though, is I wish people went back and just read some of the old classic science fiction short stories. Even if you think it's aged terribly and you think it's all awful, and it's good to know it, because you are really talking about a field that's evolved over 100 years, and pretty much every idea you have, someone came up with it already. Someone's already developed. And the nice thing about science fiction is someone came up with an idea, and then someone took it and ran with it, and then someone else came and took it, and the whole thing just keeps repeating itself over and over. So it's not so much about having ideas as having new variations on old ideas. So I find myself really drawn occasionally to going back to some really classic old stories and thinking, how can I put a twist on it? Or how can I explicitly reference it? Because I'm writing a science fiction story. I know who came up with this idea. So I'm just going to acknowledge that. I'm just going to, so I have robots talking about the 3 laws. And they say, look, the 3 laws are really, obviously they're completely non-workable. The 3 laws of robotics that Isaac Asimov came up with, that AI scientists are actually still talking about today. The whole thing was just designed to create paradoxes so you could write short stories with. It doesn't work. But I like the idea that robots in the future kind of respect the philosophy behind it. I've got this robot who, I'd like to follow the 3 laws. I mean, unfortunately, they're not practical, but as an ideal, I really like them. So, you acknowledge what came before and try and move on and do something new and original. So those are my 2 sort of, the most recent stuff and the older stuff, and anything in between.
And the great part is that, like Lavie said, you can read a lot of the most recent stuff for free online. I mean, a lot of it is free through, current publications. And so you really get to see what's being written right now, and which makes it easier to follow, like, how is the genre evolving, especially if you have that background of reading the older stuff.
It's also, I think it's great to read stuff you don't like, and it's great to read stuff that you think, I can do better than this. I think that's a very big motivation for writers, is the first time they read something and said, this is rubbish, I can do better than this. So I think that's really important. Recognize what you don't like, recognize what you would like to do that would be better than that, or would address that, would fix that. But I think science fiction is a genre that is very much in constant dialogue with its past and with its present. Mm-hmm. And again, to not know that, to come at it without having read anything, it's probably not a very successful strategy.
Mm-hmm. So I want to sneak one last question in here. I know we're going a little bit over, but just a real quick answer of if you could give one piece of advice to writers that want to get into, whether it's science fiction or fantasy or whatever, what is your one piece of advice to them? Lavie, can we start with you?
Well, I think my advice was, write science fiction because it's easier to sell. I'm going to stick with that one. Yeah.
No, that's great advice. And Lesley, how about you?
I would just say that go out and read what's currently being written. See what other people are exploring and how they're exploring it, and really kind of like invest in the community, because there is a great community out there. And I think that it can be beneficial to know where it is.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that is all the time we have for today. Again, we went a little over. Thank you both for being so flexible with that. Real quick, next week we are going to be back on Wednesday as usual with Inside Flash Nonfiction. But for today, Lavie, Lesley, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
And everyone else, we will see you next week. Have a good one.